Hello everyone, it's Spencer here from the UK Colour Pencil Society with a video today looking at how to achieve smooth backgrounds in colour pencil. Something that often gets asked and was asked recently in our UK CPS Facebook group, and both there and on our online forum we run monthly challenges. So we decided to make January 2025 a challenge on exactly that, how to achieve a smooth background, a blurred background with an image in colour pencil. And that forms the basis of just this little quick demonstration today. It comes from the word bokeh, and it's originally a Japanese word which means a smooth and soft background, a hazy background, and that's what you see here. You've got that beautiful creamy smooth out of focus background and then a sharp in focus main subject, and the eye is naturally drawn to that in focus area. So it really does draw the attention of the viewer, something that we can utilize as an artist. Having said that, colour pencils, as I'm sure all of you know, particularly anybody who's done any sort of number of drawings and spent many hours with their cherished pencils creating, colour pencils are brilliant for fine detail. But when it comes to a large surface area on a large white page and trying to cover it, it can really be quite difficult. And there's an element of counterintuitive sort of nature of achieving this soft look with colour pencil. So hopefully you'll pick up some tips during today's short demonstration. Generally speaking, the way the eye works when we look around a scene is our eye is constantly refocusing. So we see everything more or less in sharp focus. But with a camera in our hand or with a colour pencil in our hand, we have the opportunity instead to direct the viewer to a particular area of interest that we want them to focus on. And one way of doing that is exactly that, making sure that that subject of interest is in focus and the other area around that, the background in particular, recedes. So the main subject would pop forward and the background would recede. The two work together, as you can see here, to make sure that we are focusing on the one area that's in focus, and that draws our attention. Another example here in the photo, you've got this beautiful cream smooth background. It's probably quite an expensive camera lens that's achieved this, but you can do it on less expensive cameras. If you set your iPhone or your Android on portrait, it will often achieve this same effect where you've got a very shallow depth of field where the main subject's in focus and then the rest is blurred. So one final picture before we start. This particular example shows, again, a very soft background, but this time you've got circular specular effects, and that quite often appears where you have light that's out of focus. That could be just little gaps in foliage with light, and the sky behind always tends to be brighter natural sky in daytime, coming through and forming a circular effect that's all soft and out of focus. So that's again something, an extension of the theme that you might be trying to achieve. So I think that's enough of the theory now. We'll try and move on to start our project. And if you are doing it for the challenge, do please share and post in the forum and on the Facebook group and across your social media, because it's always wonderful to see people creating and having fun. The image I've chosen to draw today is one of my own, and I'll show you here. It's some backlit leaves. I couldn't tell you which ones, I'm afraid. I did look it up on Google Lens and it came up with several very improbable things which I didn't think would be growing in the south of UK in the winter. Nevertheless, it's very high detailed and we'll talk more about that later, but crucially for the purposes of this demonstration it should be something fairly quick for us to do with the background, and that's particularly what I want to focus on here. This is more about the background and how to achieve that smooth but blurred effect rather than the actual subject. Nevertheless, we'll move on to transfer of the drawing first to our paper, and then we'll do some swatching, and then finally, hopefully, will make something appear that looks vaguely similar to the photo. It doesn't have to be exactly the same. I'll settle for something somewhere close, and hopefully we'll learn some things along the way. So this segment of the video is going to be looking at how to transfer an image, or at least one option. On this particular occasion, I'm going to be transferring the image with graphite paper. Of course, there are plenty of other options, whichever suits you, and normally for a subject like this, I would probably sketch it on a sketchbook and then transfer with tracing paper, or maybe even go direct to the final paper that I'm using. Gridding is another option, and there are several others beside, even projecting if you wanted to do that. In terms of the transfer with graphite transfer paper, the method I'm going to use today is something that I would tend to use more for portraits and things like that. And I do appreciate that it's quite a contentious subject, how people transfer. I'm a great believer, though, in whatever achieves the results that you want in the time that you've got available to you. And there's no doubt that this method of transfer can be a time saver for many, and that's something that makes it possible for people to create and fit into busy lives. You can buy ready-made wax-free graphite transfer papers, and I prefer to use graphite rather than the carbon ones because they can be that bit messier, and I truly get covered in anything pigment-based that I'm using. Clothes, face, hands, everywhere. It just ends up everywhere, so I'm all for trying to work as clean as possible. I have actually made my own, and I'll show you that in a moment, but it is possible to get transfer paper in different colours, so it doesn't need to be just graphite. You can get bright colours, you can get white, and they can also be useful when it comes to transferring an image with this technique to coloured papers and toned papers. In terms of the image that I'm actually going to use here today, it's my image, and it's 8 by 6 inches. It's been resized to 300 dots per inch, and it's been printed out on an inkjet at lowest quality on standard paper. And the reason for that is obviously not a fine image print. I'm really just looking for basic shapes. So it's been printed real size, that's the crucial thing, and 8 inch by 6 inch. So you'll need a piece of paper suitable for that. This is going to be transferred onto Strathmore Bristol Vellum Series 300, so a relatively inexpensive paper and widely available, so it can be quite popular for that reason, I think, as much as anything. Before I show you my well-used and homemade graphite transfer sheet, I'll show you essentially what I've done here. I've got an A4 backing board, and I've taped to that the actual Strathmore 300 surface that you can see there, tape top and bottom in my case, and then I've made a hinge of tape which I've put the reference image on. So when it comes to transferring, we need to put the graphite transfer sheet face down underneath this, between the paper that we'll be drawing on and our reference image. So I'll show you my homemade, Blue Peter made graphite transfer sheet. I have to be careful handling this because it can get dirty quickly. I've very helpfully written on here this side to paper, because the number of times I've put it upside down and you end up just with a lovely image on your back of your printed reference image. It's really frustrating. But essentially here I've used graphite powder and applied that to a glassine sheet, which this was free because it came within the, so to speak, because it came in between the leaves on a pastel mat pad. But you can buy them, as I say, pre-made, and they're relatively inexpensive. So a few general hints and tips with them. I store mine in a plastic wallet because it makes everything around it messy. It rubs off so easily. You just breathe near it and you'll get covered. But also don't press too hard down when we actually come to transferring. You need to check that you are transferring successfully, but you don't want to be scribing or indenting a line into the paper that you'll be working on, because of course with colour pencil it will show. So I'll put this in between now the reference image and our paper. It's important not to be leaning on this with your palm, because the moment you do, it's going to transfer quite an amount to the paper underneath. And I tend to use, instead of a pencil or something like that to draw over the reference image, I tend to use a red pen just so that I know exactly where I've been. And I'm not, when it comes to actually drawing, going to be using this printout as my reference with red all over it. I tend to use an iPad or similar, but it's whichever suits you. Some people prefer to use a printed image, particularly if they're using grid methods or something. But in this case, I'll be using an iPad or similar to refer to my reference image when it comes to the actual drawing. One of the first things I do, if I just pull that taut so that I'm roughly in a consistent place each time, is I'll mark the edges of my image. And I tend to do this because it makes sure that I can check early on that I am actually getting a transfer, which is always reassuring. But also it gives me the boundaries for the actual image when it comes to the final drawing. So yeah, that's not too bad, and it's quite clean at the moment, so I'll savour that as a victory whilst it's like that. I'm sure it will get worse. Okay, so pulling it taut is quite awkward. Apologies for the glare. Let's move ahead. And again, I'm not looking for any great degree of detail. I just need basic shapes. Everybody's preference varies really when it comes to transferring an image, how much you actually put across. I know when I started, I used to put an abundance of detail in my transferred images and it looked like a bowl of spaghetti. And then you come to look at that and you're trying to recreate and draw with it after, and I found too much information was overkill. So I tend to be less is more. I could say I'm lazy. There's that as well. But certainly I find less detail tends to suit me better. So I tend to go for the big shapes. Again, as I said earlier, one of the key things is not to be pressing too hard. I don't want to be scribing lines and indenting lines that are going to cause me problems later on. We might actually use some indenting later on when it comes to the veins on the leaves, but at this size of image, I'm not going to be recreating all the cellular detail of these leaves. We'll be looking for an overall effect. And I think certainly the main purpose of this demonstration anyway is the background. So we'll be looking at how to achieve that smooth background and using OMS, I think is the method we're going to be doing on this case. So I'm not being too fussy about this. I don't know how much of this you can see, but it's just the main outlines I'm looking really to record. And then later on, we can go and put in a level of detail that's suitable for this scale of image. Apologies if I'm not saying much. This is actually my first video. And it's proven incredibly difficult to concentrate and speak at the same time. There we go. So that's my main image outlines. I will resist temptation. I won't actually pick the paper up and see if that's transferred yet. I'll trust it. I'm just going to put some of my main leaf veins in that I can see. when I actually come to do the detail section of the leaves later on, I won't go into too much detail, but I'll be able to just use these to get my bearings, really. I tend to only put down enough just for that, to help me establish my position and not lose my place. I do find, as I say, if I put too much information down, it can almost be the opposite effect. Having too much information makes it very difficult for me to establish where I am in my drawing. And I can find, after drawing for an hour, that I've drawn completely the wrong bit and everything begins to look a bit disjointed. So best avoided, and I stick to keeping it fairly simple. I think that's more or less there. Let's see how that looks. Wish me luck. Ah, not bad, not bad. I can live with that. Maybe I should put some veins or something in those other top leaves. Yeah. Again, that's the handy thing about using, for me, a red pen, purely because I can see quite easily where I've been and where I haven't. My observational skills obviously should be fabulous as an artist, but sadly they're lacking, very lacking. I once spent 30 hours on a drawing of a very colourful fly that I thought was fabulous, and it was only when I got to the end I realised, to my horror, it was actually dead, and I had to draw wings on it to bring it back to life artistically so that I could post the image. So I'm a bit wary about my observational skills, something I should work on for sure. There we go, that should be somewhere handy. That's pretty good. Okay. What I tend to do at this point is draw the boundaries for the image, and then reduce how dark the values are on this transfer using a putty rubber. So I'll just pause the video a second and go and get a putty rubber. Bear with me. Okay, that was a quick search and I found some. So I'll just draw the outer boundaries, and then I'm going to use some blue tack. You can use a putty rubber if you've got one, but I actually prefer blue tack myself. I think I was traumatized by putty rubber because when I started, it was a good year before I realised you had to take it out the packet, much to my embarrassment when I found out. Nevertheless, I find blue tack really good, and this particular one I use white, so it seems to be a bit of a cheat really to call it blue tack, but nevertheless it's really effective. I prefer it to putty rubbers, and I tend to just roll it across the top of the image so that it's light, so I can just see it. I'll make sure I leave it enough so that you can see it on screen actually, because it's a lot brighter on screen than I'm actually seeing in person. So just roll it into a cylinder, good to warm it up between your hand really, and then lightly rub over. Now the thing about graphite, you may or may not know, but it's often used as a lubricant in engineering. It's really slippy. Colour pencil doesn't adhere wonderfully to an abundance of it, so you definitely don't want lots and lots of graphite down, because it can make it particularly difficult for the colour pencil applied on top to hold. It does need some tooth available to stick to. I actually started out with graphite just before I moved to colour and colour pencil, because I found colour pencil so intimidating. The thought as a non-artist at the time in particular. Probably not even now, but certainly at the time I found it quite intimidating to think about using colour. So there we go. Hopefully you can still just about see that. I might just try and reduce my lighting just a little bit so that you can see it better. So I would actually make it lighter than this normally in normal circumstances, but I'll leave it at this just so that you can see it. So that's how we achieve our transfer of an image. So make sure your image is real size. Use graphite transfer paper rather than carbon because it's that bit cleaner. Make sure you clean your hands in between. Don't rest with your palm on the transfer paper because it will transfer quite a smudged block of graphite onto your pristine paper. And what else have I got? I have a handy set of tips that I've written down just so that I remember to tell them to you. I think that's pretty much it. But in terms of the level of detail you transfer, just whatever suits you, whatever works best for you. The big shapes work for me. So that's our transferred image ready. And I have very cunningly left lots of spare paper around the side, and I tend to do that all the time so that I can swatch, and I'll come to that later on in the monthly challenge part of the video. If you're actually watching that, you won't see that if you're just seeing how to transfer an image and it's by itself. But nevertheless, I like to have plenty of paper around the outside so that I can swatch my chosen colors and select some different techniques that I think will apply well to that piece. So that completes the paper transfer. Okay, so moving on to swatching and colour choices. Selecting colours is often something that causes people a lot of difficulty. I tend to use a digital program like Photoshop or similar, or at least enlarging images just to see what the specific local colours are in the areas of interest. On this particular project, I've made sure that I've also printed out the image with a border around and swatched on that so you can get a better idea. And I'll make sure this file is available along with the reference photo somewhere for downloads for this project. It may well be in the Facebook group and on the forum, but nevertheless they will be available somewhere. I might even put a link below this video on where to find those, as well as a list of equipment as well. So I've used the Derwent Lightfast here, highly lightfast colours, range and fabulous quality. They last a long time. There is one Derwent Pro Colour, the Chinese white, in there. And again, use whichever pencils you have. Similar colours wouldn't be a problem at all. It's just to get an overall feel. And whilst there are some differences on higher oil-based pencils compared to higher wax-based pencils, the differences can be overcome. When it comes to the actual colours that I'm selecting, particularly for the background, I'm matching more closely what I'm seeing on screen than what we're seeing on the printout here. But nevertheless, I'm not necessarily looking for an exact match. And one of the great abilities of the artist is to shift colours a certain direction as you see the need to, based on what you're seeing in front of your eyes. So it's very much an action and a reaction. So the swatching is the starting point, but we'll be prepared to mix it up as needed with some of those other colours being introduced into different areas. We'll also try and get some of the circular, smooth, blurred effect in as well. So moving on to some of the extra equipment that we're going to be using on this demonstration, other than the pencils and your chosen sharpener. I have some paper stumps, or tortillons, I think they're also called. I'm sure they're more expensive if they're called tortillons when you buy them. Sounds like much posher, but I find them particularly useful when it comes to blending with OMS. I've got a slice tool. You don't have to obviously use this one. This is ceramic, but you can also use just a craft knife, and it's optional. You don't absolutely have to use it for this project, but there are just some areas on the reference where there is it's such a strongly backlit leaf that there is almost like some white hairs on the side of the stem that I'm intending to use that for. I also really love the Derwent blender pen for small areas, and that's going to come in handy for me when I almost block in, if you like, around the leaves where the paper stumps, whilst you can get them down to a fine point and you can clean them on sandpaper and all sorts of things like that, nevertheless it's a lot easier to do precise work around the sharp edges of the leaves and the boundaries of the main subject using pencil applied directly to the paper and then the Derwent blender pen and blended into the main background from there. We've also got the Derwent USB rechargeable eraser, and I love that. I think it's fabulous. It comes with 2 different sizes of eraser. You can clean them easily, again using sandpaper, and one charge on the USB side of things, it lasts forever, and really good value tool. I may well use that, not necessarily for mistakes, I'm hoping I don't make too many of them, but nevertheless for lifting out highlights it can be helpful because it can almost blend as well, and that can be useful on the background or on the main subject. And then finally I've got the OMS, and there are several ones out there. Gamsol is often quoted as being particularly good in terms of being low toxic. I use this one from the range. It was been fine with me, but I do know that some people are particularly sensitive to it, and you do need to use in a well-ventilated area. Make sure you put the lid back on and make sure it's safe from small hands or anybody who could basically open it and come to harm, because it's not a nice chemical to have around in many respects. There is another one called Zestit, a lemon-based citrus smelling one is the one I had. I think they might also do an odorless one, but I totally got put off that because I did leave the lid off once and I knocked it over on my dining table and the whole table smelled of lemons for months, and I'm pretty much, that's it. I can't go near it now. So I go for the odorless varieties. Now, the final thing you see here is this Caran d'Ache palette, and I love this. It's a bargain, relatively speaking, when it comes to art equipment, because it's not always the cheapest of hobbies to pursue. But this particular palette is slightly rough surface to it, and you'll see on the demonstration that takes the pigment off the pencil, and I very much like blending with OMS on the stump directly on the palette and then applying that to the paper. And I particularly like doing that because I am not stressing the paper in any way. I'm not running out of tooth particularly, and I can then adjust colors as I go, and it can be particularly effective, certainly in smaller areas. If I was doing this piece much larger, rather than using paper stumps, I may well instead apply pencil direct to the paper and use tissue or kitchen towel. I think probably a paper towel. That would be a better description. I know Americans, kitchen towel, paper towel. I can't remember which way round it is, but it's different term. So nevertheless, for this scale, I'm going to use the paper stumps. So I'm going to show in this section some of the different ways of using OMS with colour pencil and how to apply it, as well as some of the problems. I'm going to show using a paper stump briefly and also a paper towel. I tend not to use brushes too much myself. That's not my preferred method, but if you do use brushes, always best to use the cheaper ones, the synthetic ones, rather than any of the more expensive watercolour specialist brushes. So I have a little bit of OMS already on a clean paper stump. I'm using a clean paper stump for this first segment on what goes wrong if you don't layer enough pigment down, purely because you do get a build-up of pigment on your tools which could cover a multitude of sins. It works great later when you're looking for a smooth background, but I do want to show exactly what happens if you don't have enough pigment down. So just a single layer, something like that. The OMS is actually dissolving the binder and then the pigment remains. And this has worked of a fashion, but it's not exactly very vibrant, so you are losing some of the vibrancy and lacking coverage. And that is, of course, one of the main strengths of using OMS. You can cover the paper tooth quite rapidly. So I'll just top up the amount of OMS on the paper stump. On the next problem example, I've laid pencil down far too heavily. This is a bit exaggerated really, but I'm hoping it will show it. And what tends to happen, whether this will show it or not, is that it can be that bit harder to get a smooth overall finish because I've been so heavy-handed with the initial lay down of pencil. So I mean, it is dissolving it and it is blending, and you could carry on and on that, but you have got nice sort of vibrancy of pencil there, as opposed to where we've not used enough pigment, but some of the harsher lay down marks are still applying. So moving on to what I would do if I was applying colour pencil direct to the paper, I tend to use the side of the pencil so that I can get more rapid coverage, and I also find it a lot harder to apply pencil too hard this way. So again, probably a pressure of about 2 or 3 out of 5, and I'll make sure that there's some overlap between colours. You can see that the paper does take up the pigment slightly more richly in some areas than others, and that's something that hopefully the OMS will blend out. Again, I'm just making sure that I actually apply a few layers here. I need to make sure I get enough pigment down. You can always add pigment later when the paper is damp with OMS. You just have to be careful not to use a sharp point and press too hard, because the paper is obviously particularly delicate at that point. Okay, let's try and blend that. Always go light to dark, as I mentioned on another part of this video if you're here for the project. And again, the reason for that is to not drag darker value pigment into my lighter areas. I'm getting to the point where I'm almost running out of OMS. I can tell because it's not dissolving as readily. So I would probably, normally speaking, if I was taking more time and this was a real piece, add a little bit more OMS there. But nevertheless, I think that shows up not too badly. I don't think I'd be unhappy with that. So next step, I'm going to show using a palette, whether we use the pigment laid down on a scrap of paper, and then again the paper stump. I'll top up a little bit. I like this method for smaller areas. I wouldn't necessarily do it for a large piece, but nevertheless you can put pigment down on the paper or in a moment on that plastic palette, and you can get quite a nice subtle effect. Just picking up from almost your colour spot on the paper. I think I'm going to need to add more OMS. It does evaporate quickly. You can see we're getting not necessarily the same value, but it's not bad. We're getting a very workable effect there, and we're not stressing the paper at all as we apply this just with a paper stump, unlike potentially with pencil. As I said earlier, you can go over and just add a little bit more if you wanted, to blend and to smooth out any application. You see this one's still damp, that one's perhaps evaporated a bit more, and you can see there that you very quickly are getting a nice vibrant effect with full coverage of the paper tooth. So it's much the same when it comes to doing this same technique on the plastic palette. I think it's plastic. Can't remember exactly what they said. There was a particular name for the material it is, but I'll call it plastic for now. So again, just make sure I have enough OMS. You can clean these palettes, the plastic one, with one of those magic erasers, those foam magic erasers. Works really well. So you can see I'm getting a little bit more vibrancy and depth immediately, or better values, darker values. So again, exactly the same effect really. You don't have to have this. These are about £8–9 from memory, but you don't have to have it. I just find them useful. So again, much the same. You can again even that out by adding very light layers of pencil direct and then blending that in. Just add some more OMS to add some darker, scumbling almost, and you can achieve a nice soft look. You can almost achieve a similar effect to an airbrush like this. So you can see some of the OMS has come through on some of those applications. As I mentioned earlier, as the tools become saturated with colour, that works in your favour when it comes to doing a background where you're looking for similar colours throughout. But when it comes to changing colours, if you've got very different colours, you do need to get either sand it down, but you need a clean, fresh start. You can also use paper towel, and I'll just show that briefly. Again, with paper towel, once you start building up colour and OMS on the actual paper towel, it becomes more and more effective, and you can get such great rapid coverage this way. It can say goodbye to large expanses of white paper quite quickly. So again, just a little bit of OMS, light to dark. And you could layer that again. You can see some of the tooth, or at least some of the texture showing through there. And you can also, again, to even out, just very lightly go over direct with pencil, increase the vibrancy. So that's another way of doing that. When it comes to the project for January 2025, if you are actually doing that, I will be using the paper stump. So moving on to the background, we're going to be applying the pigment with OMS as shown on the previous demonstration on the techniques, and we'll be looking to achieve a smooth transition with the circular effects as well. I tend to just dab the paper to get rid of some extra graphite that may be there before I start, and then add the pigment direct to the palette, making sure that I've got enough. And I wear a mask as well because the OMS can give me a headache even with the window open, so wearing a mask avoids all of that. I also tend to make sure that I've got enough OMS down and pigment added to cover the tooth of the paper, and I can build up and layer just as in other colour pencil techniques. But crucially, with this particular technique, I'll also be looking, whilst the paper's still damp, to add further colour pencil with the side of the pencil direct to the paper, and that requires care without too sharp a point. And much as I showed you on the techniques, I'll be topping up pigment directly on the paper throughout this section on the background. For the specular circular effects, I'll also be adding white directly on some of the areas to the paper and just smoothing out, casting your eye over the whole background and smoothing out the whole area, adding dry pencil once the OMS has evaporated and dried as needed, and that helps to achieve a consistent smooth look throughout. This section has been sped up because it still takes quite a while, because it is colour pencil after all, but nevertheless I have sped this section up, and I'll stop speaking in a moment and I won't add any music. But if you do have any questions, do fire away, and you can find me on Facebook, as good a place as any to find me, I suppose, and in the UK CPS groups and on the forum as well. So enjoy. Do make sure to do this safely, well-ventilated room, a mask if needed, and have fun. And I hope you achieve a nice smooth background.